Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
So the question arises, what do you do when a person, for instance, what do you do when a validly consecrated bishop consecrates another person and has the right to be able to do so? So, or even not. So let's take the example again of Susie having lunch today with Bishop Joe Vasquez of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin. Susie, you're excited about having lunch with Bishop Vasquez today. After lunch, you ask Bishop Vasquez to lay his hands on your head, and he actually does it. He consents to consecrating you a bishop, and he goes ahead, Susie, and he consecrates you a bishop. Now what? In sacramental theology, we come up with a distinction, and that distinction is between valid and licit sacraments. That sacraments must be, that the sacraments are valid and or are licit. Let's talk about what these two words mean. So, we use two adjectives. We say that a sacrament is valid, and we say that a sacrament is licit. The nouns for these adjectives, so these are the adjectives. The nouns are validity, the validity of the sacraments, and the licitness of the sacraments. Follow me now then, because in sacramental theology, this is a fundamental principle of sacramental theology. We talk about how it is that sacraments are valid and licit. What does it mean to be a valid sacrament? The validity of the sacraments lies on whether a sacrament is valid or not means that the sacrament was done in the correct way. For the Eucharist to be valid, we must celebrate with bread and wine, the Church has said. I can't come into Mass one day and use pizza and beer and consecrate them as the body and blood of Christ, as sacrilegious as that sounds. Why? Because the validity of the sacrament depends on us using bread and wine. Of course, this can be problematic in some places of the world. Think of places, for instance, in Asia, in Eastern Asia, where there's more rice than wheat. For us to be able to say that in order for it to be valid, you must use wheat bread. It's a question of validity. In order for it to be valid, the Church has said you must use bread and wine. Another example, baptism. What does it take for a valid baptism? We've talked about those two requirements already. In order to be validly baptized, the Catholic Church has said this for years, including the Roman Catholic Church, including the American Catholic Church, including the Eastern Catholic Church. What does it take for that sacrament to be valid? You must be baptized with water, and you must be baptized in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The Catholic Church says, if you are baptized with water, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, it is a valid sacrament. What does it take for a valid ordination or consecration? Deacon John was recently ordained a deacon. What does it mean that he was ordained a deacon? Do we know whether his ordination was valid or not? If a person is ordained, what does it take for a valid ordination? That a person be ordained by a validly consecrated bishop. And so if a person is validly consecrated and has the intention of consecrating or ordaining another person, then that sacrament is valid. Do we sort of understand what it means for a sacrament to be valid then? So if I decide in Holy Family to start baptizing with milk, is that going to be a valid baptism? No, it's not going to be a valid baptism. The Church says, in order for it to be valid, you have to baptize with water in the name of the Trinity. If I decide to baptize with water, but in the name of other gods or goddesses or other titles for God, wait a minute, you're encroaching on the validity of the sacrament. In order for it to be valid, these things must take place. Validity of the sacraments is one thing. What does it mean when we talk about the licitness or the licit nature of the sacraments? Whether or not a sacrament is licit. What does the word licit mean? It's a fancy Latin word meaning legal. Whew. Follow me now. So, the sacrament of the Eucharist. The validity is one thing, that we have to do certain things in order for it to be valid. The licitness of the sacrament is another thing. So that, for instance, let's use the sacrament of marriage. Because I remember as a Roman Catholic priest, the sacrament of marriage had to take place in a church. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin said, in order for you to marry outside the church, you must have the permission of the bishop. So now what happens? Let's imagine for a moment that Father Jamie is feeling a little pastoral. There's a couple that really wants to marry, but for whatever reason they can't marry in the church, and we don't have time to be able to get the permission of the bishop to be able to do what we're going to do. And so we decide to have a marriage outdoors. Is it a valid marriage? Is it a valid sacrament? Yes, presuming that we've fulfilled the requirements for the validity of the sacrament, but it's not legal. Because the Roman Catholic Church said it is illegal. You cannot do certain things. So, let's use another example then. What about ordination or consecration? If Bishop Joe Vasquez, loved the man, forward-thinking as he is, what if he decides today to ordain? Susie's asking for consecration, but what if instead he says, Susie, I'm not ready to consecrate you because I have to ask for Rome's permission, but what if I ordain you as a deaconess or as a priest or priestess instead? What do you think of that? Ooh, interesting scenario. Bishop Vasquez, thank you for raising that idea. So, if he were to ordain Susie, then the question becomes, is that sacrament valid? And also the question is that sacrament licit? In many places, we have said that if a validly consecrated person lays his or her hands on another person, then that person is validly ordained. John Paul II begged to differ. His argument was, all the apostles were men, and so in order for the sacrament to be valid, you must be a man. Does that argument hold? We know enough about church history to know that women were ordained deaconesses and priestesses during the first 600 years of the church. Pope John Paul II's arguments do not stand. Because we validly ordained women for centuries. Now, it's another question as to whether it's licit. Is it licit for Bishop Vasquez to ordain a woman? Ooh, he would be in so much trouble. If he tried to ordain you, Susie, he would be in so much trouble. Why? It has nothing to do with the validity of the sacraments. It has to do with the licitness of the sacraments. That sacrament would be valid even if it would not be legal. And that's why, for instance, in the underground churches of the decades, we remember in the 1970s, there was a famous woman priest in Eastern Europe. She was considered to be validly ordained because a Roman Catholic bishop who was validly consecrated ordained her. The challenge was that he dared to ordain her when the church said that that was not permitted. So it was a valid sacrament, but not a licit sacrament. So how interesting that when it comes to, for instance, all of these other divisions in the church, so we suddenly had the Archbishop of Utrecht, who was able to validly consecrate other bishops, and it was legal or licit for him to do so. And so he did it. And when the Archbishop of Utrecht did that to different people then, what happens when those people decide to consecrate others? Regardless of whether that person is male or female, married or unmarried. The Orthodox Church has never had a problem with married clergy. Never. Right? So what if a person in the Old Catholic Church, if a validly consecrated Old Catholic bishop were to consecrate a married man as bishop? Would it be valid? It would be valid. Would it be licit? Sure. There's nothing saying you can't do that. Now that we are outside the Roman Catholic Church has its own rules. We love Roman Catholics. We respect Roman Catholics. They have their own set of rules, and if they want to play by those rules, that's up to them. If they don't want to ordain women, that's their thing. We don't have those rules. If a validly consecrated bishop wants to ordain another bishop who is married, then he or she has that prerogative. Or if he or she wants to consecrate a woman as bishop, we argue it's valid and it's licit. These distinctions are important. Why? Because Bishop Joe Vasquez, since we're mentioning his name, he dared to share a letter with Roman Catholic churches here in Austin, Texas in April. Perhaps we may remember seeing copies of that letter. I don't question the fact, I don't believe Bishop Vasquez is an evil person for a moment. So I'm guessing that either he skipped certain fundamental classes in sacramental theology, because we all learn these things in sacramental theology, in liturgical theology, we learn these important distinctions. So for Bishop Vasquez to say in a letter, sacraments conferred by Reverend Matthias, and he was talking about me in this letter, may be either invalid or gravely illicit. He could not have in good conscience signed a letter saying those things. Because let's follow what's happening here. That the sacraments conferred by Reverend Matthias, and he's talking about me, Father Jamie, are either invalid. Wait a minute, what does it take for the validity of sacraments? It takes a person being ordained by a validly consecrated bishop. Many of us remember we were there. You were there when I was ordained. March the 10th, 2001. Who ordained me? The Most Reverend Gregory Amond, Archbishop of New Orleans. So if you are questioning my ordination, who really are you questioning? You're questioning the person who ordained me, who was Archbishop Amond. Are you trying to say, Bishop Vasquez, that Archbishop Amond is not a validly consecrated bishop? Ouch! I'm not going to get in between the two of you. I'll let the two of you sort that out. But if a validly consecrated bishop ordains a person, then that person is validly ordained. So to see a letter like that saying that his sacraments may be invalid, we won't presume that he's an evil, malicious person, but to sign a letter saying something like that, he knows better. If he really did send that letter, if it wasn't signed by someone else on his staff, if he really sent that letter, he knows better. What does it mean to say that a sacrament is illicit? Well, there we'll concede that if you're not following the rules of the Roman Catholic Church, then the Roman Catholic Church has the right to say that your sacraments are illicit. Right? And so, for instance, if Bishop Vasquez were to decide to consecrate Susie as a bishop, or to ordain Susie, let's go with the example of ordaining Susie. Bishop Vasquez has ordained Susie. We would argue that it's valid, but certainly not licit. You did something that is illegal at present in the Roman Catholic Church, some would argue. Wow. So, those are two very important distinctions, because when we talk about the sacraments of any church, the question is, are their sacraments valid and are their sacraments licit? And so all of the sacraments of the American Catholic Church and the Old Catholic Church are valid. They may not be perceived as licit in the eyes of the Roman Catholic Church, but they are valid. They are all valid. And Bishop Vasquez knows that. So the validity of sacraments is always important, because if you're being confirmed, for instance, the issue is raised. Confirmation by Archbishop Johnson in the American Catholic Church. Are you really confirmed? You are really confirmed. When you are confirmed by a validly consecrated bishop or archbishop, you are confirmed. When you're confirmed by Bishop Joe Vasquez of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Austin, presuming that he is a validly consecrated bishop, then you are validly consecrated. Licit, though, let's just be honest, whether something's legal or not, who determines that? The people who make and or interpret the laws. And so it doesn't bother me at the least. If someone wants to say that my sacraments are not licit according to the Roman Catholic Church, I will sleep well tonight, because the sacraments are valid. And so from the time that I withdrew from communion with the Roman Catholic Church, from the time that I stepped outside the Roman Catholic Church, you could argue that my sacraments were not licit if you were Roman Catholic and if this mattered to you. But could you argue that my sacraments were not valid? You cannot.